Mike, tell me
Right.
about yourself. Tell me what's going on.
Well,
Hold
we
on, let
had
me
a
put your
nice
car on
surge of
already, Mike.
business. Once again, you turned on my light. I don't know how you do that. Uh, yeah, a nice surge of contracts at the end of August. And I was hoping that that was a sign of things to come. But then first week in September, it slumped again. So I think that's normal. That's right after Labor Day, and not a lot of people thinking about buying a home over a holiday weekend. So we'll see what the rest of the month brings. I mean, so far, hurricane season's been very mild, so I'm counting my blessings on that one.
Yeah, we got to get what, 6 weeks, Mike? If we can get us through 6 weeks, we'll be in good shape.
Yeah, I follow hurricanes very closely, and the ones that typically hit the west coast of Florida are usually an October event. So the
Yeah.
month of October makes me a little nervous.
Yeah, so the next 6 weeks should tell us whether we're in for trouble or not.
But so far, it looks good. I mean, really, the Atlantic's been pretty quiet.
It has. Last night when I was coming home, I live on Marco, as you know, and I mean the island was just boiling, overspilling with water. It was flooding everywhere. It was crazy. And then we wake up in the morning. It'd been raining most of the night, and it was dry. It's
I
like
had
it,
an odd thing 2 years ago. We had a really torrential downpour from a rainstorm. And I'm driving down my driveway, and all of a sudden, I see these walking catfish everywhere. And I have absolutely no idea where these catfish came from. But that was an interesting sight.
yeah. So what happens? And I was looking for it yesterday, but I did not see any catfish. The the ponds fill up, they spill out into the sidewalks, and the catfish they hop along. It's actually kind of wild. Kind of wild. All right, so Mike, let's get started. No one wants to wait. They want to learn about leasing, right?
I want to learn more about leasing, so believe me, you've got my attention.
All right, well, tell me, Mike, your office, Downing Fry, does a lot of leases. You do a lot of seasonal and annual leases. And you mentioned earlier that, it's kind of it's a lot of work. So is that kind of the mentality on leasing generally? It's like, oh my gosh, what a pain, but it's almost like a necessary evil when you are in the real estate business.
Well, I think the mindset of your typical real estate agent is they don't want to do a lease, but they're afraid if they don't do that lease for the owner of the property, then when that person goes to sell their property, they're going to use whoever they use for the rental. So they
Yeah.
don't want to lose that potential source of business down the road. So then they attend one of our rental lease classes that we provide for training and do the lease. I don't think a lot of them want to do the lease, but they're doing it to protect their future business.
Yeah, I had an agent I work with quite frequently, and she didn't want to do leasing, so she was going to refer it to someone who does a great job. And she said, "Well, I want some sort of agreement in place where that realtor can't steal my client." I said, "You're not going to be able to do that." I said, "The leasing is not a huge moneymaker, even for the people that do it full time. So they also want to, their customer service, they're motivated by wanting to service the entire customer. And so you know, referring all this business to someone, it's tricky. It's very tricky because they want to do your job and you don't want to do theirs. So I think the what I told her, not to say, I didn't tell her that she needs to start doing leasing. That is totally up to her. But I said, you have to be confident in your business and the value that you bring to your customers. If you are always looking over your shoulder and worrying that this person's going to steal my client or that person's going to steal my client, that is a losing situation. It might be true occasionally, but if you're good at what you do, you shouldn't have a problem referring business out. So we'll start by leasing and saying, if you don't want to do leasing, don't do leasing. If you don't think you can be good at it, if you think that, it's a pain in the neck and you can't charge enough, just find someone who's great. Find someone who's great, partner with them, give them the money, and say, look, I'm trusting that you'll do right by my customer. And by me referring the right customer, I think it does look good on you. Mike, I had this come up yesterday, or maybe it was 2 days ago, on Monday. I went to lunch with two awesome realtors, and they asked about estate planning. And I think they assumed that I was going to say, oh, I do that. I'd be happy to help you. But instead, I said, look, your situation is, it really deserves someone who's a specialist, someone that only does estate planning, who's really good at it. Here's his name. And by the way, his name is Jeff Grant. He's at Grant Cottrell. They were shocked because Cottrell Title and Grant Cottrell, they're a competitor of mine. But Jeff is excellent. He's a great estate planner. And for something that's somewhat complex, that requires probate, that requires someone with really good bedside manner, I want to refer the best. And I think Jeff is that person. So find that person in the rental if it's not you. And if it is you, for example, sometimes I will do some estate planning. I will help someone with a power of attorney or a simple will, but it's not my primary business. It's not something that I'm, necessarily promoting in any way. That makes sense?
I'll give you an interesting, talking about leases, Christian, interesting statistic. We do a lot of rentals. Our rental listings are up 27% from where we were a year ago, which I find very interesting. That tells me a lot of people are buying properties and turning them into rentals, or maybe it's a seller who's frustrated because his property hadn't sold. So then he's thinking about, well, maybe I'll just rent it. And
Well,
that
and
might be more of the case.
great point. I'm glad you brought it up because even if you have a listing and maybe now it's stale, it's just been sitting there for a little bit longer, your seller's going to start asking, well, what if I lease it? And they're going to ask you first. They should ask you first. So you have to know the basics on leasing. You have to know that, hey, look, if you want to lease it, why don't we just do a listing for the lease and a listing for the sale? We can do both. Why not? Or in my description, I'll say seller is open to leasing, bring all offers. Now, maybe that's enough. Maybe you say you know enough, and I'm going to teach you in this video what to look out for. But maybe that's enough to say, yeah, I know a little bit about leasing. And that's why I want you guys to be paying attention to this because leasing is going to creep into your business whether you want it or not, whether it's an existing client asking you about it or you seeing an opportunity where, okay, leasing starts to make sense. So that was a good point. 27% increase, Mike. I don't think that's by accident. I also don't think it's because people are buying properties specifically to lease. I think it's because they're looking for a way to monetize an otherwise home they can't sell. All right, so first things first, we just talked about it. There is a leasing listing agreement. And if you want to list the home for lease, you got to do one of those. So there you go. You're smarter than you were yesterday. The second thing, you have to see if you're allowed to lease. Mike, where you live, are there any rental restrictions at all?
Where I live,
Yeah. Where you actually live, your home.
not that I'm aware of.
Wrong. I set you up.
You did set me
Rental
up.
restrictions. There are several of them. So you live in Collier County. You are not in
Okay.
an HOA, but there still are Collier County rental restrictions. There are rental ordinances. There are also county and state taxes for short-term rentals. So you absolutely have restrictions.
I
Surprise.
thought you were referring to community restrictions. So
I
I'm
know you did.
give
I
you
set you
partial
up.
credit on that one.
Yeah. So even if you're not in a community, so it's a perfect opening for that. If you're in an HOA or a condominium, you first have to look at what those restrictions are. And I actually do this whenever I'm talking to someone about buying a condo or an HOA. Because Mike, as you know, there's that condo review period for every new condo. And they say, well, I want to review the condo docs with you. And I'm happy to do that. And I say, well, I need to learn a little bit more about you. what are you choosing to do with this property? Are you going to live in it? Are you going to rent it? Are you going to let your friends use it occasionally? Do you have a pickup truck? Do you have a pet? I had a client, and I've said this on the video before, who had a parrot. And there was a $10 million condo, and it was conditioned on the parrot being approved. So rentals should absolutely come into every discussion when someone is buying in an HOA or a condominium because they've got the most restrictive rules. But there are also some. Mike, I had one deal where they were selling a duplex. So it had two units, two separate units, but the landlord, the seller, was actually renting it out by the bed. Now, this is not uncommon for certain types of properties. It is happening. It's pretty frequent. So they would rent it out. They would, if there were two beds in one bedroom, they would rent it out to two different people, two different family members. And there are a couple issues with that. Number one, not allowed by Collier County. So Collier County has very strict rules on how many families can be in each unit. It's really one family per unit generally. Also, even if the buyer was willing to accept that, and the seller obviously was, well, now we have a problem because this buyer wanted to get a loan and they could not underwrite the income. So they were getting, let's say it was $500 a bed every month. So they would get, I don't know, let's say it was $5,000 a month for one unit and 4,500 for the other unit. Well, realistically, because they were in violation of those rental restrictions, the lender couldn't receive, they couldn't count all that 9,500. They had to only count maybe 5,500 because market rate was more like, 2 or 3 grand per unit, not the 5,500 that the seller was actually getting. You ever had any examples like that, Mike?
From time to time, I, I do have a wide range of stories with respect to rentals, and
Oh,
I do have some problem
let me see if
areas.
I can pick up on that.
All right.
All right, so obviously you're going to want to do some analysis. So even if your buyer is not intending to rent, I want you to ask them when going over condo docs, hey, generally look at the documents to see if it allows rentals. I'll give you an example. Autumn Woods, which is a neighborhood near our office here in Naples, beautiful neighborhood. There are homes that you can buy in there. There's some really neat properties, anywhere from maybe 400,000 or 500,000 up to 1.5 million. And someone might go in there and say, oh, wow, this would be a great rental. And it is a great rental market. But short-term rentals are pretty restricted. I think the minimum is 30 days and maximum 3 rentals per year. So you're not going to be able to rent it out weekly or nightly or anything like that. You're really looking for more, a long-term seasonal or a true annual lease. Luckily, these homes are kind of built for that. That neighborhood is very family oriented. So that shouldn't surprise someone, but they need to know. So even if you're representing a buyer and you don't do listing or leasings, you probably need to point that out to them because I would hate for them to buy it thinking they could do weekly verbos and not be able to get that.
Particularly if your buyer is an investor.
Definitely. Investor, or a lot of times, Mike, we have someone who will say, well, and this goes to a different point that I've heard a lot recently. They're buying it for themselves, but they'd love to be able to rent it out when they're not using it. So if they say something like that, just to help with cost or whatever, um, key in on that and make sure that they do their due diligence and be careful if you're recommending it. So if the buyer's like, oh gosh, I don't think I was willing to spend that kind of money, if you just flippantly said, well, what if you just rented it in the summers, or what if you rented it, January, February, and you used it March and April? Maybe that offsets some of the costs. Be careful. Just be careful that that's allowed, and don't ever put yourself in the position where the buyer's like, well, you said I could rent it, weekly or nightly or monthly. You may not be able to. Don mentions, Mike, you mentioned 27% increase in rental listings. What percentage is long-term versus short-term? Do you have any of that information?
I did not drill down on that one. So if And I
I would
couldn't even
say
guess on
your
that, to be
firm does a
honest.
lot of seasonals. You do a lot of seasonals. I would say it's probably the majority of your firm doing the seasonals. So you'll help someone buy an expensive home or a condo down near the beach, and then they want to rent it out. And honestly, your office does a great job. And one reason in particular. And maybe two. We'll give you two reasons. Number one, you do require that all your agents take a course, something like this, that they do the research, they get the training, and they're not just going out there signing leasing and not knowing generally how this works. And a good example is these short-term rental taxes. If you don't know about the short-term rental taxes, you really can't be an effective agent in the leasing market. The other reason why I think you do a great job, Mike, is that you treat it like a closing. So there's a lot of paperwork and you're very diligent. The same process that you have for purchases and sales, you use for your leasing product as well. I think that's the way you should do it.
One critical point here, Christian, is most people are not aware that the counties, Lee and Collier, audit rentals.
Talk to me.
And
You
they
might have
will
some of that
they will
experience.
literally show up, want to see your rentals, and if they see someone is having problems with their rentals, they will pull every rental that agent has done for 3 years and literally be there for
What are
several
they looking
weeks.
for, Mike?
So, and that's why we initiated the rental training classes, so to prepare agents so they don't ever put themselves in that position, because it's not fun. I mean, it's a very tedious audit, and usually there's money involved.
Well,
So,
what are they looking for? What are some of the issues they audit?
well, I think they want to make sure that the property, the proper taxes are paid. They want to make sure that you're not practicing being an attorney. They
I
want to
think
make sure
they
that
care
the
about the
paperwork's
taxes more
complete.
than anything.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things they look for, and frankly, they don't tell us everything they're looking for. They tell you where the problems are. We had an agent that I think did everything right, and yet they still came down on this agent, and we appealed it all the way up to the state level. But I can tell you at the end of the day, the agent ended up writing a check because that was cheaper than fighting it.
Yeah. Don asks, do you recommend the owner collect the rents directly and pay the appropriate taxes directly? Mike, do you know what your office does regarding those sales taxes?
We handle it several different ways, but I can tell you, we had one time where the owner was collecting it and paying the taxes, and the owner did not pay the taxes. They held the agent liable for it.
Did they
Which to this
really?
day, I don't understand that one.
No, that doesn't make sense. I would say a lot of times you want all those taxes to be paid and submitted right at the beginning. Because the landlord, the owner has the biggest risk there, that there's going to be a lien on the property for unpaid taxes or a lien against the owner personally, potentially. Separately, if they believe that the agent was complicit, or like you said, Mike, they're just going after you anyways, it could be really problematic. So I've seen it both, like you said, Mike. I've seen where it's paid all through the department. And honestly, this is something that I've seen come up. So the sales tax is if you have a seasonal lease, if it's 6 months or less, then you have to pay a certain amount to the county and a certain amount to the state. I think it's a total of 11%. And you have to register. So a lot of times, if there's no agent involved, I have to help these clients do it. And I have the seller register with the county and register with the state. And then they have a portal and they can submit that payment. Um, this is something that you collect from the tenant 99 out of 100 times. It's not something that the seller just pays and doesn't get reimbursed by the tenant. So it's all part of the lease. Um, I do love the idea where the brokerage receives all rents, makes sure that all taxes are paid, holds the deposit, and then just remits the balance to the owner of the property. I think that is the cleanest way to do it. It's a lot of liability on the brokerage, and there should be a cost involved in that regard. but it's this cleanest, simplest, and most professional way to do it. Some sellers are going to fight you. And Mike, you were telling me that based on that 6 month thing, there's some people that would do a 6 month and a day lease, right? How
We
does
get a
that?
lot of battles on that one, Christian. I mean,
Yeah,
that,
tell me generally what that battle looks like.
well, we know what they're trying to do. It's trying to get around the sales tax thing.
Yeah.
And so it's something we frown on. But and there are some disagreements in that area. But on the other hand, the code's pretty clear. I mean, I would respect your opinion on that, but
So what Mike is saying is the statute says 6 months or less, you pay the tax, and if it's greater than 6 months, you don't, right? It's actually pretty black and white. So it's been the practice of a lot of people historically to do a lease for 6 months and a day and just not pay the tax. But like you said, Mike, when the state comes in and audits you, they think that you're evading taxes. They think that you're a criminal.
now let
And
me give you an argument. Let me give you an argument on that.
please.
Sometimes they'll make it 6 month and a day or 6 month and 2 days, depending on where the weekend falls at the end. So, maybe it's a holiday weekend or something like that. And that's why they added an extra day or two so they could, move out or, whatever. And
Yeah.
sometimes there's a reason for that extra day or two. And that's where, I struggle with that a bit.
So I think a lot of people, what they do is they do a 7 month lease so that it's clearly not 6 months in a day, but it's also not a 12 month lease. And they just, they do their best to comply with that law without being cutting it too close. It's all about how close you're willing to cut it. And really the brokerage, if they are on the line, if you have a real estate brokerage involved on this, they're going to have a rule like that. They're going to be pretty strict of like, we don't do 6 months in a day. And the owners just have to understand why that rule exists. Now, I saw one, Mike, that I thought was way more egregious. They really wanted a 3 month lease. They wanted January, February, and March. But they signed a 9 month lease and then gave the tenant the ability to cancel under certain terms and conditions. So if the county ever looked at it and said, that is a 3 month lease. They say, no, it's not. It's 9 months, and I didn't have to pay any taxes on that. I just, we terminated the lease after the 3 months. It didn't work out. I think that's egregious. I would not recommend you do that. I think that anyone that's suggesting it is really putting them in a bad spot. It's bad business, and even if you have a seller that would want to do that, I don't think you should be involved. You have too much to lose. It's not worth it. Mike, have you seen that before?
Yep, I've seen that scenario. I've seen a lot of different scenarios.
I've even
Uh,
seen it where, let's say we're not fighting over the tax. I think the tax part is probably the worst. I don't want to ever be labeled as evading taxes or a criminal in that regard. Separately, so people will say, well, this one's easier. So in this scenario, they do similar thing. Let's say the association requires 90-day rentals and your tenant only wants 60. So you rent it out to them for 90 days, and the tenant has a separate agreement that terminates under the tenant's unilaterally, the tenant can terminate on day 60, and they don't have to pay the third payment. That it's not tax evasion because you're still paying the 11% tax, but it is an evasion of or a skirting of the association rules. Really, really tricky. Really, really tricky. I don't like it. It's definitely a violation of the rule because intent goes a long way. So I just don't recommend you suggest things like that. If you have a buyer and a seller that are doing it personally, they understand the risks and they do it, and you're not involved, I think that's okay. But realtors being involved on these deals, it can really sabotage your business and your reputation. Don has another question. Mike, in a perfect world, would you prefer short-term rentals or long-term?
well, I like long
Or
term.
on-hand property management? What have you noticed?
I like long term. They're cleaner, but on the other hand, particularly January, February, March, there's a lot of money in short term rentals during that time of year.
Right. So let's talk about that. You have long-term rentals, you're usually getting less monthly, but you might get more because it's over an entire year. Short-term, you can rent it out to the person, maximize the income, limit the wear and tear on the property, and then maybe still use it yourself for the other months. So I have some clients that own property in golf communities, and so they'll rent it out top dollar, December, January, February, March, maybe even April, and then they'll use it all the other months and they'll come down and they'll play golf and they'll invite their friends down, and that's amazing. I think that's incredible. Mike, I even thought, if I own something in the future, it could be my escape plan if I need to leave, maybe a short vacation, I need to get away, or maybe there's a storm coming and I need a place to live. I thought that would be a cool idea, but you're short the seasonal rental. The only way it works is if you plan on using it yourself as well. It's not going to maximize your income. It's just not.
I almost called you on a rental property that I have, Christian.
Oh, I'm glad you didn't. Oh my goodness.
Second floor unit, and the prospective tenant wanted to move in a 60-pound pig. And it was a comfort animal. That was an interesting one, but they ended up selecting another unit. So you got off the hook on that one. You got lucky on that one.
I got lucky on that one. So here's another problem that I see. Let's say you have a beautiful home and it's yours and it's your homestead, it's your primary residence, and someone knocks on your door and says, I would love to rent your property. I noticed that you're not here in the summer months anyways. I'll give you, $10,000 a month for June, July, and August. And you're like, whoa, that would be awesome. I'm not even here. Be careful.
Don't
Mike,
do it.
why do I want them to be careful about doing that on a primary home?
Homestead exemption.
Exactly. So there are lots of rules for you to look at on homestead rules, and we've done videos and articles on this before. You can probably rent it one time in that year. You could rent it for that summer and be okay, not risk your homestead. You never had the intent to rent it. As on January 1st, the intent was to be your homestead. So you're probably fine in that first year. The problem kicks in when you get to the second year. If at the end of that 3-month term, the tenant says, that worked so well, I'm going to be back here next year and I'd like to do the same thing. And this time I'll give you 20 grand a month. Well, I want you to be very, very, very careful because you could be putting your homestead election in jeopardy, which would increase your property taxes, potentially make you subject to creditors, liens, and lawsuits, things like that. It could increase your insurance as well. It should increase your insurance if you have it. And it might even violate some of the association rules or short-term rentals. So just be very careful. Brett asked, would the homestead be in jeopardy if an owner used the IRS 14-day rule? Absolutely. So Brett is talking about the Augusta rule, which was built off of the Augusta Championship, the golf championship, where you can offset the income. You don't pay taxes on the income if it's in that certain window. Pretty, I'm not a tax attorney. Do your own tax research. But yes, if you rent the property, you can be putting your homestead in jeopardy. Maybe not in the first year, definitely in the second year, definitely. And so that could be pretty traumatic. Now, if we talked about insurance briefly, let's talk on that as well. When you rent out the property, you have a higher level of liability. And there's an old Warren Buffett saying, when you win the game, quit. And what I gather from that saying, and I don't know exactly what he meant by it, but in this context, it means you've really done well. You have a rental property, you have this investment that's earning income. Hopefully it's not dependent on whether you're going to be able to eat that night or not. You've already kind of won the game. You have so much money, you're putting money in investments. Well, don't risk it all simply because you were being cheap. Don't be a penny wise, but a dollar foolish. Get insurance. Get insurance against fires, against slip and falls, against hurricanes and floods and things like that. But get the good insurance so that if something happens while someone is borrowing your property, then you are covered before it gets to you and where you live at night. Mike, have you ever had any issues on your rental property?
Yeah, actually, I've been very fortunate. I've had some very good tenants through the years, but I remember one time where my buddy had a unit right next to me, and yeah, I had a very elderly lady who was in there for about 15 years, paid like clockwork. It was a dream situation. My buddy's unit, he got someone, even though it wasn't allowed, he got someone who was a chain smoker.
Okay.
Big problem, you
Yeah,
know, and he found out too late. The place reeked by the time he
I
took
bet.
possession of it.
Yeah, it's tricky there. You have to think about what you're allowed to restrict and what you're not. Terry had a point. She said, my broker doesn't allow the agents to lease. I have a seller or owner who has rented his property through VRBO or Airbnb. Says the company takes care of everything. I have zero idea and didn't investigate. I don't get involved at all. He does follow the HOA rules. So, Terry, this is a great example. I agree. I think Verbo and Airbnb is a great option. They can prepare leases, they can accept payments, they can make sure all the taxes are paid. I really do like it. The challenge is when that owner reaches out to you to sell. If they now ask you, all right, I have a lease, it's good through the end of the month or it's good through the end of the year, but I want to sell, can I? And that's why it's important to do a little bit of due diligence and start to investigate what is a lease, what does it look like, what about extensions? So let's go into that point, Mike, before we end today's call. How I think about leasing when it comes to a closing. So the first thing is on every sales contract, there is a box for whether there's a lease or not. You would have to check that box if that lease is going to go to the next owner. Because if you didn't check the box, let's say you just forgot to do it, but you had told the buyer, hey, there's a tenant, and their lease is good through the end of the year, and the buyer said, all right, great, cool. If you didn't check the box and the buyer had a change of heart, they could say you didn't provide the property free and clear at closing. You didn't give possession at closing. So on our neighbor and FAR contracts, make sure you check the box. And what it says is that the seller is going to share all leases to the tenant for the buyer for their review, and that they'll turn over rents and security deposits and everything else like that at closing. I believe it gives the tenant the ability to review and terminate within a certain time period. Um, and so that's the first big thing is make sure that box is checked. Secondarily, if you are the buyer, I don't think you should be using a standard contract. Again, you should use an as is because if that lease is exactly what the seller told you, but you had a change of heart, or the insurance was way too high, or you ran into the tenant and you did not like what you saw, you need to be able to get out. You just do. And you don't need to have to explain yourself in that regard. So the tenant is very, very important. The details matter. Doing your due diligence, very, very important. And it's not like a defect and cosmetic issue. So I think the best thing, even though that checking that box will give you some protection, the best thing is to have that as is period so you can actually talk to the tenant and have that dialogue. Mike, have you ever heard of a tenant estoppel?
Yep.
All right. So tenant estoppels are similar to an HOA estoppel or a city or county estoppel. It basically is a clarification or a confirmation of what the tenant pays, how much is left on the lease, and what the security deposit is. So we put together a tenant estoppel. It's a letter like this, and we give it to the tenant. And we have the tenant answer questions. When is the rent due? Are they current? Are they allowed pets? Is there a deposit for the pet? Things of that nature. When does it end? When does the lease end? And does it have automatic extensions or renewals? That tenant estoppel is incredible. It's a wonderful tool because you know who signs it? The tenant. The tenant signs it. So you have a lease that's given to you by the seller, and then you have a tenant estoppel letter that's signed by the tenant, and they should match. If they don't, you have to be able to walk away. You have to say, wait a second, something's not adding up. It could mean that maybe the landlord didn't share the addendum or the amendment. It could mean that the tenant is a crazy person. Who knows? It could mean that they've been leasing for so long that they don't actually have a lease anymore. It's month to month. So the tenant estoppel letter is a wonderful tool. And so, Terry, to your comment, if that seller asked you to sell, I would want a tenant estoppel letter. I want to say, look, let's see what all the policies and procedures are with Airbnb or VRBO, and let's understand who these people are, when their opportunities are. Mike, we have a lot of deals, and this is going to happen as we get to the later part of this year, where owners start taking deposits on seasonal leases. And then they decide, you know what, I'm going to sell anyways. So we do a closing in November, and there are three leases lined up for January, February, and March. And we have to be very careful that we have all the paperwork. And VRBO is actually really challenging, and Airbnb, very challenging because they don't let you assign those leases to the new owner. You have to cancel them, and then the new owner has to start over. Really, really tricky. Have you had any of those problems?
Yeah, I think it's a common problem, to be honest.
Yeah, it's very common. Susan asks, is a buyer required to honor a lease that's already in place? Yes. A lease goes with the property. Now, there might be some language in there that allows the landlord to terminate, especially if there's a sale, but that's pretty rare. Almost every lease goes for the time period. The landlord can't terminate it and the tenant cannot terminate it. It is actually unusual to have an early cancellation clause in the lease. So the standard is that the tenant has the unobstructed right to live at the property, and the landlord has the unobstructed right to receive rent. That's what the lease is, and it's rare that they can terminate early. Yvette says, does anyone have companies they trust and recommend to use for seasonal or annual rentals? Yvette, there are some really good companies, but be careful. So get good recommendations like you're doing. If someone has recommendations for her, please reach out. There are really good agents that will do it. And they've built a nice little side business doing that. Yvette, in fact, on Marco, a friend of mine at Harborview Realty, they do a really wonderful job. I would reach out to them. Or Steve Purcell, who I've known for a long time, his old firm, they do a lot of rentals as well. Mike, do you remember Steve from back in the day?
Oh, yeah, that name goes back a lot of years.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
You,
Mike,
you
any
know,
other points that I've missed today on our leasing? It's pretty
yeah,
high.
there's an interesting problem that we see frequently, and that is a case where, let's say, the unit is rented to a single person, and then partway through the lease, the boyfriend or the girlfriend moves in, and then that
Yeah.
becomes a problem. Why does that become a problem? Because they weren't approved by the association. And so you also have to look at the lease as far as what does it say about guests?
Oh, it's
And
a very important part. Yeah.
that's a very interesting area. And then the other scenario I see is someone has a yearly lease, and 4 months into it, they get another job, they move out and they rent to someone else and don't even tell the landlord.
Yeah.
Huge problem.
Subleasing. Yep.
These are things that pop up that you need to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. And Vicky, you asked, should a new lease be done when or before a sale happens? Not necessarily. If it's a lease that can be assigned or just taken over by the buyer, you don't need to do a new lease. If you have, whoever the new owner is will just step into the position of the old owner. VRBO and Airbnb are the only two places where we have trouble doing that because you can't assign those to the new buyer. We've tried to do workarounds. I had one where we put money in escrow, and when the landlord was paid the rent and the tenant vacated, then the escrow money was paid back to the buyer as their rental income. Really kind of messy, kind of a you probably didn't even follow that. We put money in escrow, and the when the seller got paid the rent through Airbnb, then the escrow got released to the buyer. So it was the only way I could think to do it outside of canceling those leases, refunding the tenants, and then hoping to find a new one. Really, really challenging. But otherwise, you don't need to do a new lease. The new buyer can just assume it or get it assigned.
You know, I got
Mike,
one other issue, Christian, I
please.
want to throw out, and you've come across this before, and that is the case where the property is rented, but then the owner decides to put it up for sale during the term of the lease, and the issues that pop up with a tenant not wanting realtors to go through with people while they have their lease in place.
Right, that's right. A lot of leases have restrictions on how much notice you need to give to be able to show the property. And I would say it's pretty normal that there's nothing in the lease about showing the property. The only time a landlord should be able to access it generally is if it's an emergency or a maintenance issue. Um, However, some leases do have language saying that within the last 90 days of the lease, the landlord is permitted to show the property and has to give 24 hours notice. And then even fewer leases will say that they can do that the whole time and not just the last 90 days. But Mike, you and I have had problems where the tenant doesn't care what the lease says, they just say no.
Yeah.
And
And
that's really a problem. There's not a whole lot the landlord can do. They can, try and bribe them. I usually recommend you take them to dinner. Hey, here's $100. Go to dinner on me. We're going to show the property. Or they say, look, I'll let you out the last month. You wanted to leave early. You find this middle ground. I suppose you could file a lawsuit. That's not going to be very fun. I don't know if that's really a great option, but it's always a possibility if the tenant refuses and the lease allows it. Cool. Mike, I appreciate the insight.
good info today.
With leasing, even if you're not a leasing agent, it's important to know some of the simpler details. Read the lease, understand the details, and know who the tenant is. You got to have that connection. All right, Mike, call me if you need me on that pig.
You got it.